everyone, I'm Danny Roddy of DannyRoddy.com, and today I'm talking with Georgie, aka Haydut of RayPeteForum.com. Georgie is an independent health researcher and the owner of Idea Labs, a small company producing high-quality, boutique supplements with the focus of supporting a healthy metabolism. Today, Georgie and I will discuss weight loss from a bioenergetic point of view, or the interaction between sugars and fats and how they influence cellular respiration. In addition to thanking Georgie for talking with me today, I'd like to thank my patrons for making this show and all the content I produce possible. If you'd like to become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/DannyRoddy. Without further ado, here's the show. This is not something I'm specifically interested in, although it gets like such a common question, and I feel like it's a product of the dumbing down of the nutrition scene, and it's like a question that's phrased often, like if you're recommending sugars in the diet, like how are you going to lose fat? It's like everybody knows you have to go on a low-carb diet to lose fat. Yeah. So I thought that would be a good starting place. And then from there, we can talk about free fatty acids, the hormones. We don't have to dive too much into PUFA because obviously we did the whole show in it. But right. I was curious, like we both have a low carb experience. I thought we would tie that into the show. If I play devil's advocate and George and I ask you, how would I lose fat on a high sugar diet? What would be your response?
So my response, I'll explain the process a little bit, and it may sound initially a little bit counterintuitive. However, I'll just say that the latest drugs for basically combating obesity and diabetes are based on inhibiting the hormones cortisol and adrenaline, and these are the stress hormones, and they're involved into actually increasing lipolysis and fat oxidation. So if the mainstream drugs for reversing obesity are actually acting in a way of opposite of fat oxidation, that the common perception of burning fat to lose fat, it's probably not medically sound. So I want to start with just by describing that if you keep fat intake low and you inhibit the excessive liberation of fatty acids from the tissues, over time your insulin sensitivity will improve and the insulin levels will go down. And insulin levels is what driving insulin and cortisol is what's driving the storage of fat. So this means that when sugar is ingested, if stress is low and free fatty acids are low, when you ingest sugar, it will be oxidized because the Randle cycle is not being blocked by the excess fat. And thus the sugar, even if you eat a lot of it, it will not be turned into fat. And by the way, even if you have problem oxidizing sugar, the so-called de novo fatty acid synthesis from sugar is energetically a very expensive and inefficient process. And there have been some human studies on that in healthy and obese people. And then basically they found that the de novo fatty acid synthesis from carbohydrates does not occur until you ingest over 500 grams of carbs daily. And that's more than twice the amount of carbs that people ingest daily, at least in the Western world, on the standard American diet. So even if somebody has a propensity to convert carbs into fat due to a deficiency in, let's say, vitamin B3 or biotin, taking a little bit of those, a little bit of niacinamide, can prevent or at least inhibit the excessive conversion of carbohydrates into fat. So in summary, I would want to say that weight gain, especially fat gain, is due to high stress hormones because that results in the liberation of free fatty acids, which themselves cause insulin resistance both through the Randle cycle, because they prevent the oxidation of glucose, and also fatty acids have been found to be direct insulin receptor antagonists. So this means that free fatty acids will make you insulin resistant and also prevent your cells from oxidizing sugar. The fatty acids will also increase serotonin, especially PUFA, serotonin and cortisol, and this will promote the stress state even more. The fatty acid increase serotonin by activating the enzyme TPH, tryptophan hydroxylase, which inhibits the synthesis of niacin. It diverts the metabolism of tryptophan away from niacin and towards some excitotoxic byproducts of tryptophan. So if you combine the stress metabolism with a high-fat diet, which is the typical standard American diet, this means high insulin, right? So fat storage will be high, hyperglycemia, and hyperinsulinemia. On a high sugar, low-fat, moderate protein diet, let's say, metabolism will increase due to the sugar's effect on thyroid hormone and protein's effects on thermogenesis. And basically, over time, the liver will be able to excrete the excess fat. And many drugs currently on the market are actually targeting the enzyme 11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1. This is the enzyme that synthesizes cortisol. And inhibiting that enzyme and effectively lowering cortisol has been shown to lead to weight loss regardless of the diet. Whether you eat high sugar, high fat, high protein, etc. Anti-adrenaline drugs like clonidine have been shown to do the same. In other words, drugs that lower the stress hormones and thus lipolysis, because lipolysis is triggered by the stress hormones, drugs that lower the stress hormones lead to weight loss. And this is fairly well established medical fact. It's just that pharma industry has not yet gotten a drug like that approved, but they're hot on the trail, and that is the mechanism of action. They're basically, these drugs are acting, anti-stress, anti-lipolysis, anti-oxidation of fat, and they invariably lead to weight loss.
You mentioned the Randle cycle, and myself coming from a low-carb background, this was, I think I first read about it from Ray, and I was just completely oblivious to this idea. And it's not actually a cycle, but it helped me at least understand in the beginning how I had been fooled by the idea that fat oxidation was preferable over glucose. Can you explain a little bit about the Randle cycle? And I'm still confused why almost no low-carb person I've ever read ever mentions it.
The Randle cycle is also known as the glucose fatty acid cycle, and it is a metabolic process which involves the competition of glucose and fatty acids for a substrate of oxidation. In other words, your cells at any given point of time sense the presence of either glucose and fatty acids, and they can only process one at a time. I don't know if the exact ratio is known, but let's say if you have a ratio that favors more fatty acids in the bloodstream versus glucose, your cells will oxidize the fatty acids and they will ignore the glucose just because they can't oxidize it. That's what directly leads to hyperglycemia. Your cells just cannot process the glucose as long as there is a sufficient amount of fatty acids in the blood to prevent the oxidation of glucose. And it has been shown that inhibiting lipolysis, which lowers the amount of free fatty acids in the blood, effectively allows the cells to resume the oxidation of glucose. Unless you have another problem like a deficiency in one of the enzymes of the Krebs cycle, or there's deficiency in the electron transport chain. But by and large, in most people, lowering the free fatty acids will reverse this insulin resistance, the inability to oxidize glucose. And several drugs on the market that try to do that, but niacinamide has been known to do it efficiently very well, and so does aspirin.
The way I see it, the low-carb idea is just completely, the low-carb weight loss idea is just completely divorced from the whole individual, what hormones are going up and down. And I think even Paul Jaminet, famous from the Perfect Health Diet, I can't remember the exact quote, but I remember him distinctly saying that he thought that the hormones were too complex to write about. And I think that it really encapsulates almost everything wrong with that point of view, is just not accounting for how many variables are involved in the idea of supporting oxidative metabolism.
Yeah, let me touch a little bit upon that. So a lot of people will say, just like you mentioned, don't you have to liberate the fat from your stores in order to lose it? And just like I mentioned, there's always some lipolysis going on, whether you like it or not. You cannot inhibit it completely. And at rest, your muscles burn mostly fat. So I would say that a proper regimen of weightlifting, maintaining an anabolic environment, a high sugar diet, and low stress will actually burn the fat much more safely than the strenuous exercise. Some fat is actually also excreted by the liver through glucuronidation, and that process is actually inhibited while you're under stress. So your liver understands that excess fat is not good, and it does its best to try to excrete it. And by stressing it out with excess with strenuous exercise, the liver is busy processing all the toxins that are released from your colon and intestines as a result of the bacteria getting irritated and producing endotoxin. So the process of glucuronidation almost completely stops while you're under stress. So basically, at rest, the muscles consume mostly fat for the muscle. That consumes mostly fat for the muscles and especially the heart, and mostly glucose for vital organs like the brain, the brain and the gonads. So fatty acids are transported in the blood mostly to hepatocytes, which are liver cells, adipocytes, which are your fat cells, or muscle fibers. Niacinamide helps the hepatocytes glucuronidate and excrete the fat. And it does this by inhibiting the synthesis of triglycerides by the liver. So fatty acids reaching the liver while taking niacinamide will tend to get excreted instead of converted into triglycerides and transported to the tissues for oxidation and storage. Muscles oxidize the fat as their main fuel at rest, and with proper insulin sensitivity, the fat will not be stored into the adipocytes. In other words, if your liver is doing well, it's not stressed, the hepatocytes, so you have three targets of the fatty acids: your liver, your fat tissue, and your muscles. And if you're not under stress, your liver and your muscles will take care of the fat that you want to lose. So in order to keep the fatty acids only going to the hepatocytes and muscles, insulin should not be high, which means no stress, which means no high cortisol, no high adrenaline, no excessive lipolysis, and thus no insulin resistance. In other words, if you want your insulin to be low, you should not have lipolysis. These free fatty acids destroy your insulin sensitivity directly, both through the Randle cycle and by being an insulin receptor antagonist. So keeping the stress hormones at bay is paramount for both the prevention of storage of dietary fat and also allowing the fat to be properly oxidized and excreted without additional stress. As I mentioned, the stress inhibits the glucuronidation process and also makes the cells produce lactic acid instead of oxidizing the fat properly through beta oxidation.
When you cut your carbohydrate intake and you increase your fat, you mentioned how central the liver is just for everything. When you decrease the liver's glycogen content, do you think that also contributes to the stress state?
Whenever the glycogen is depletes, blood sugar starts to drop, and that's a signal for the brain to start producing cortisol to keep blood sugar at a level that's necessary to keep the brain active, right? So as soon as your glycogen stores are depleted, the stress hormones kick into action. Cortisol will rise first. You'll start breaking down muscle tissue, and it will redirect those amino acids to the liver, where through deamination and transamination and gluconeogenesis, the liver will produce glucose. However, if the stress continues, the organism realizes that more energy is needed, and then adrenaline will rise, and adrenaline will start shedding your fat tissue and basically releasing all of these free fatty acids in the blood, providing energy because glucose is not enough, not even glucose through the breakdown of muscle tissue.
Thus why a ketogenic diet is an abomination.
Yes, a ketogenic diet is probably the strongest signal for the organs that you're under some kind of a stress. I guess starvation used to be a very common type of stress that every animal, including early humans, endured. But it can be, just psychological stress can trigger that as well. Whenever you're under stress, your energetic requirements, of course, dramatically increase, and you can deplete your glycogen stores a lot more quickly. Typically, they can last for up to 5 minutes in a healthy person, because the health of the liver is what primarily determines how much glycogen you can store. And given how poor the liver health is in the Western diet, most people probably have a little bit of glycogen, maybe enough to sustain them for 30 seconds to a minute, which means any stress more than that puts you in a stress state and starts the stress hormone cascade. And I want to talk a little bit about why burning fat is not preferable to oxidizing glucose. And I have some examples from the animal world, which apparently are very well known, but nobody talks about them, even though they're directly applicable to humans as well. So as we all know, an organism can generate energy either from glucose through the activity of insulin or from fat through the beta oxidation and the Krebs cycle. At rest or during brief activity, the organism prefers glucose. However, just as I mentioned, prolonged exertion or stress depletes the glycogen stores and leads to the increase of the stress hormones and then lipolysis. And given the high caloric density of fat and its ease of storage, it seems relatively plausible, at least the evolutionary biologists agree, that animals evolved to use fat mainly as fuel storage to be used during prolonged famine. And prolonged famine is a very good example of stress. This is supported by the fact that glycogen stores are limited. So fat is our energy reserves, and reserves are typically used when the primary source of fuel is unavailable. Typically, in nature, the lack of primary source of fuel is tied to adverse events, and they may last a while. And as such, the use of fat as fuel is typically as a result of adverse events. However, fat itself contributes to the adaptation to the adverse events, and it slows down the oxidative metabolism so that the fuel reserves can be conserved even longer. So it becomes a vicious cycle. I would want to bring up the example of hibernation because it illustrates very well the Randle cycle and the insulin resistance and diabetes. So it's known that hibernating animals burn primarily fat while they're asleep because that's the only thing that can sustain them for 3 to 4 months a year. And it has been well known that actually they become temporarily diabetic. I posted a study on the forum and I talked to the author of that study, and he said that it's very well known that the most studies have been done on bears. So I'll talk about bears. That when bears hibernate, they do become fully diabetic. So basically, while they are in hibernation, they're in ketosis and they burn through their fat stores. And when they wake up, then they start refeeding and they prefer sugar-rich foods, specifically honey, ripe fruits, things that Ray has talked about. And within a week or so, they've measured this using bears in captivity. Within a week or so, their diabetes, their full-blown diabetes disappears. So this shows you that basically that stress and diabetes are very closely related. And stress can directly cause diabetes. And while in bears, this seems to be, a temporary state and it's a natural thing for them because they sleep during the winter, there's no food around. There's no metabolic and biochemical difference between the diabetes induced in bears by fat oxidation and the diabetes and insulin resistance induced by humans by the same process of oxidizing fat. And the good news is that at least if we use the bears as a model, this seems to be easily reversible by simply starting to eat more sugar, which basically displaces the fatty acids from the Randle cycle, and the cells are capable again of resuming oxidizing glucose, and the stress stops and the animal recovers. I don't know for how long this can continue before serious damage occurs. In other words, for how long can you be diabetic and still be able to revert to normal metabolism? I don't see any evidence that there's any permanent damage. I think everything is reversible under the right circumstances and with the right nutrition.
A commonality in a lot of low carbohydrate diets is an emphasis on phosphate-rich foods and either avoidance of the calcium foods or kind of marginalizing them in general. Do you think a higher phosphate amount in the diet and a lower calcium content and the subsequent increase in parathyroid hormone or PTH and prolactin and various other hormones, do you think that could contribute towards not only a lower rate of metabolism, but also weight loss over a long period of time?
Oh, absolutely. I also think, and I've noticed this on various social media sites, as well as in the general press, that in addition to the calcium-rich foods, fructose is also demonized. And everybody says, "Oh, eat glucose, eat non-refined, difficult to process grains and things like that. They're much better for you." Well, here's the thing: if everybody worries about insulin and the glycemic index and things like that, well, I have news for you. Regular sugar, since it's about 50% fructose, it's a lot less insulinogenic than starch. And also the metabolism of fructose does not require insulin. Fructose itself does many good things for the body, but some of the most beneficial ones are its ability to very quickly and efficiently replenish glycogen stores. In other words, to basically stop the stress response in its tracks. It also activates the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase, which is crucial for the proper oxidation of all carbohydrates. Fructose also inhibits pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase, which is highly expressed in tumor tissue and in people with diabetes. In other words, it inhibits the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase. It breaks it down. So fructose stimulates the enzyme that oxidizes the sugar, and also inhibits the enzyme that breaks the enzyme that is responsible for the oxidation of carbohydrates. Fructose has also been shown to deplete the phosphate stores, just as you mentioned. And the lower your phosphate stores, the lower the levels of your parathyroid hormone will be. And it has been shown that elevated levels of parathyroid hormone are directly causative of diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. In fact, animals with the parathyroid gland removed, they do not develop diabetes no matter what diet you feed them. And finally, this line recommendation of eating starches, I would say that they're best avoided. First, because they generate a lot of endotoxin if they're not well cooked. In other words, the worst thing you can do is actually eating unrefined grains, because they will make it through your small intestine and end up in your large intestine, where the bacteria will feed on them, generate a lot of endotoxin and consequently serotonin. Actually, if you have to eat starch, I would recommend, just like Ray does, eating only very well processed, well cooked starch like potatoes. I would still avoid grains like rice, because I just found out today that there's a special lignin in rice that is a strong inhibitor of the enzyme 5-alpha reductase. And given how common rice consumption is in Eastern Asian countries, according to the scientists that I talked to, that partly explains the low level of body hair in Eastern Asian cultures. I also want to talk about the calcium, just like you mentioned. Usually in the body, the phosphorus and the calcium are inversely correlated. So the higher your phosphorus, the lower your calcium, and the other way around. And calcium and parathyroid are inversely correlated. So basically, phosphate and parathyroid go together, and they're both opposed by calcium. High phosphate is not just bad because it promotes parathyroid hormone, it's bad because it has been associated with virtually every type of cancer. So the more phosphates you ingest through your food, essentially the higher the risk of developing some type of cancer. And meats are especially high in phosphates. Grains, especially beans, are extremely high in phosphates, higher than even meats. The best food you can do to keep parathyroid hormone and phosphates down, and consequently prolactin, because it's so strongly positively correlated with parathyroid hormone, is to eat calcium-rich foods, a high ratio of calcium to phosphate. And even though milk has decent amount of phosphate, the ratio is probably the highest that you can get from a natural food. I would recommend eating foods that are rich in calcium and low in phosphate, and milk products are good examples of such a food.
And you touched on the fact that sugar oxidation and fat oxidation are just completely different animals. And in fat oxidation, it skips the pyruvate dehydrogenase step. And what does that mean for our metabolism?
Well, basically, fatty acids have been known to actually inhibit unsaturated fatty acids. So Ray talked about it in one of his articles, and he mentioned one study, but I followed up on that. And I've talked to some people who work at NIH. So when you burn fat, there are only a few fatty acids that don't inhibit pyruvate dehydrogenase. And those are palmitic acid, stearic acid, and lauric acid. And those are all saturated fats. Specifically, they're found in coconut oil. They're also found in butter. And they're found in mostly in either animal fat, like from ruminant animals, or coconut oil, or other tropical fruits. So those three acids are among the 5 or 6 known that do not inhibit pyruvate dehydrogenase. All the other fatty acids do, including oleic acid, which is the main acid in olive oil. So if you're going to be burning fat, and the majority of that fat, it is known that in most people it is unsaturated fat, even if it's monounsaturated fat, you will be inhibiting strongly the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase. And the inhibition of that enzyme leads to excessive glycolysis. And many people don't want to talk about that, but a study recently came out which showed that basically excessive glycolysis, in other words, the Warburg effect, is not really an effect. It is a direct cause of cancer. Burning fat chronically, it is likely to give you cancer, or at the very least damage the ability of your cells to oxidize sugar.
And I'm looking for it right now, but you posted another study that showed that fructose increased palmitic acid. And tying back into our last show, fructose helps the liver create cholesterol for the synthesis of the youth-associated steroids.
Right, and fructose is the substrate of the liver to create glycogen. Fructose stimulates pyruvate dehydrogenase. It inhibits pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase. And in some cases, fructose actually has been shown to stop the stress response. There is a study with rats where they were injected directly with endotoxin. And of course, the typical endotoxin shock response happened. The animals got fever. They started trembling. The group that did not get fructose, pretty much all of them died. But the group that got fructose, none of the animals died, but in the animals where the shock response was not established yet, it was basically they were getting there. It stopped it completely and immediately. And also, again, I want to stress out that none of the animals in the fructose group died. So fructose is that. I also want to mention that fructose is actually predominantly the major sugar in the amniotic fluid and also in the seminal fluid. So the body preferentially uses fructose for very vital functions. So if it was really that bad for you, why would the body keep it as if it's gold?
Obviously a loaded question, but when you're looking at the anti-fructose research, do you think there's an overarching theme? What's the problem? How could these people be getting it so wrong?
Basically, if you look at the animal studies, I used to read the abstracts and the conclusion, but I realized that probably 99% of the value of a study is in the methods and materials section, which is where the scientists usually describe how the animals were treated, what the protocol was, for how long, what's the rationale for using a specific diet. I would want to say that I have seen so far no more than 3 studies that did a proper diet, in other words, separated the animals in groups, and the fructose diet, high fructose diet, was really high fructose diet. In most cases, the high fructose diet included starch, and it was also relatively high fat, even though by animal standards, it's not considered high fat. So I have not seen a good study, whether in animals and even less so in humans. I don't think there is one in humans. I have not seen a well-controlled study where an organism was fed a diet that was truly high on fructose and not high in some other substance that is known to have an anti-metabolic effect. And the ones that I have seen, and I mentioned one of them, which where the endotoxin shock response was stopped. That's one of them. I just want to let you know that dying from an endotoxic shock, or septicemia as it is also known, it's actually the third major reason of death in emergency departments. So fructose can easily stop that, and methylene blue can do the same. So you can see fructose has some pretty good properties. I think it's unfairly being vilified because it hasn't been studied properly. And Danny, as you know, lately a lot of research depends on who funds it, right? If a lot of research gets funded by an industry or an organization that has a political agenda, you're bound to get the result that you want. Otherwise, these researchers know that they're probably not going to get another funding for another study. I don't mean to imply that all studies are like that. I just mean to say that, number one, I have not seen a well-controlled study with high fructose and properly designed. And also, many of the studies that have come out that are anti-fructose seem to be sponsored by think tanks that have agenda against fructose.
In the first episode, we talked about the liberation of fat and then the fatty acids being synthesized into prostaglandins. And prostaglandins are estrogenic, and they increase the activity of aromatase. And then estrogen increases the activity of prolactin. Why should people care about prolactin, and what's the use of measuring it?
Prolactin is acutely elevated due to stress. It's also chronically elevated in virtually all chronic diseases. And prolactin is a very good marker for tissue estrogenic activity, unlike blood estrogens, which are known to vary from a person to person, and sometimes they've been found to be inversely correlated with the activity of the enzyme aromatase and the total amount of estrogens in the body. And this seems to be especially true in females. And there are a few studies out there that basically try to determine when are blood tests for hormones reliable. And they found that they're almost never reliable unless you're willing to do a biopsy, right? Which is not a blood test, a muscle tissue or some other tissue being cut out of you and analyzed. If you're using blood tests for steroids, they're almost never reliable unless there is a pathological condition like adrenal hyperplasia or some kind of a adrenal mass or tumor that produces so much hormone that it spills out into the blood. In other words, you only detect extremely pathological conditions. But for most people, they're actually surrogates of estrogenic activity. And it seems like the best surrogate so far for the activity of both the enzyme aromatase, the total amount of estrogen in the tissues, and also serotonin, the best surrogate so far seems to be prolactin. Its correlation coefficient with estrogen in tissues is over 0.9, one being a perfect one, right? So you see it's fairly close. And with serotonin, it's 0.87. So it's still pretty close. And levels of prolactin in the blood seem to be perfectly correlated with levels of prolactin in the brain. And this has been confirmed both with animal and human autopsy. So it's a test that can be easily ordered by a doctor, and it will tell you several things. I would say prolactin is a very good indication of how much stress you're under and how well your metabolism is working. If prolactin is high, you're not healthy.
I had a gentleman email me, and he said his physician wouldn't order prolactin because he wasn't an ovulating female.
Yeah, that's the problem. I also talked to my doctor about it too, and he had to find a reason to order a prolactin test and couldn't because I didn't have any of the symptoms of hyperprolactinemia. So eventually, I ended up paying for the test myself just because I wanted it. And he told me that, first of all, there's very little discussion on prolactin and its effects in males. So when most doctors go through medical school, there's very little discussion about that. And it's usually, if there is at all, it's in the context of prolactin producing adenomas. So in other words, it's a benign tumor of the pituitary gland. And those conditions are relatively rare. But in terms of how prolactin is elevated in a number of chronic diseases and how it is associated with a number of cancers in males, specifically prostate and lung cancer, whenever I told him about this, he said it's the first time he hears about it. He only knew about prolactin in the context of pituitary tumors. And it's a shame because prolactin is just as important to females as it is to males. It's a very good marker of stress and pathology in general.
Do you recommend getting kind of like a baseline, maybe getting some blood tests to make sure everything is all right, like your cholesterol level? I guess when we're talking about weight loss, we're talking about the metabolism, and just kind of basing your experience off of information that you hear, in my experience, usually isn't that great of an idea. And so kind of getting some blood tests coupled with the best information available might give the person a better idea of where they stand and what they need to do to get where they want to be?
I would just, as you just mentioned, I would actually do prolactin and cholesterol, because the two of them combined will tell you where you are metabolically. Cholesterol is chronically elevated, virtually in all people over the age of 30, and prolactin, like I said, is elevated in many, if not all, pathological conditions. So if your prolactin is high and your cholesterol is high, there is a very good indication metabolism is not working. Number one, high prolactin means your estrogen will be high, your serotonin will be high. Both estrogen and serotonin increase directly cortisol and adrenaline. So it means if prolactin is high and you don't have a pituitary tumor, which is likely to be the case, means you're relying on the stress metabolism to function. And if you're relying on the stress metabolism, in other words, lipolysis and the oxidation of fat, your steroid enzymes won't be working very well. You won't be producing much ATP, which is a required cofactor in the metabolism of cholesterol. So cholesterol will end up increasing as well. So I would say these are two basic, simple tests that can give you a sort of a rough idea of where you stand metabolically.
Georgi, thank you so much for talking with me today. Where can we find more of your work on the internet this week?
Mostly on the Rapid Forum. The website is www.rapidforum.com, one word. My username on the forum is Haidut, Haidut. My email is again Haidut, Haidut@gmail.com. My Skype nick is Haidut3, Haidut, and then the number 3. And the best way to reach me is by sending me an email or simply joining the forum and joining the discussion. I think there's a lot we can talk about.
That's going to conclude this week's episode. I'd like to thank Georgi once again for talking with me, along with my patrons for making this content possible. If you'd like to become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/DannyRoddy. Next week, I think we're going to talk about mood and digestion and how they connect in improving bad digestion like diarrhea or constipation, which seems to be a really common issue. So if you have any thoughts or topics that you want us to cover, please leave them in the comment section. And that's going to be it for this week. I'll talk to you guys next week. Thank you so much for listening, and I appreciate all of you guys. Thanks. Talk to you soon. Bye.